Well, I'm thrilled to be part of this year's NCEA conference and to join alongside so many educators and leaders who care so deeply about the flourishing of their students and also of their schools. It's my first time being part of this event, and I am eager to share what we've been learning about what it might mean to be a place of inclusion and belonging for students with developmental disabilities in your schools. I'm convinced that we are called to be schools without asterisks, to be leading society in the arena of inclusion rather than being the ones who are trailing behind. I know many of you are familiar with the pastoral statement of U.S. Catholic bishops on persons with disabilities, which culminated in this very powerful and I would say unambiguous point. There can be no separate church for persons with disabilities. We are one flock that follows a single shepherd. The same could and should be said of our schools. Put simply, the call to inclusion is not mere invitation. It stands as an explicit obligation. And so in my short time with you, I hope to provoke your thinking about what it means to move beyond the veneer of inclusion and to truly become places where children with disabilities are woven into all that you do. The church and school stories of families impacted by disability quickly break in one of two pretty divergent directions. Some families beam about the extravagant welcome their children with disabilities receive, and others speak about the extraordinary wounding they experience when they are yet again turned away. There are no lukewarm stories in this space. And so I'll be asking you to consider how the ideas I'll share might be expressed within your local school, as well as throughout your entire parish. So to set the stage for the conversation, I'd like to share just a bit of historical context, which I know for you is very familiar for many of you. But the experiences that we've pursued for children with disabilities have continued to evolve over the last 50 years. When I was born in the early 1970s, many individuals with developmental disabilities found themselves wholly excluded from so many community opportunities. They were denied involvement in local schools or neighborhoods or workplaces and other activities. They were missing from the membership rolls of most communities. So imagine each of the circles on your screen reflects a member of a community. Well, there were holes, and there were too many people missing. Well, in response to this widespread isolation, early advocacy efforts often focused on creating new spaces for individuals with disabilities to learn and live and work and recreate. New laws were passed, new policies were pursued, but the opportunities that emerged for students with disabilities tended to be offered in largely segregated contexts. In other words, entirely apart from anyone else who did not have a similar label, right? In our churches, it was separate religious education classes, specialized catechesis programs. In our schools, it was separate schools or separate special education classes. And in most communities, everyday life still excluded interactions with people with disabilities. Well, throughout the 80s and the 90s, our pursuit as a field, it continued to change, and our work focused on integrating students with disabilities into the very same schools they would have attended if they did not have a disability. We sometimes called this mainstreaming. And it reflected incredible progress, but it still most often meant a separate special education classroom that was near but not really among other students in the school. Or a special needs ministry class near but not really among other people in the parish. Near but not really among. Well, and most recently, I would say even presently, we've aimed our efforts toward the full inclusion of people with disabilities. Inclusion in the same classes and school activities right alongside their peers, right? Inclusion in the same places of worship and community activities and neighborhoods and workplaces. Really moving people from being among one another to being with one another. And I hope you see the very different portraits of community that are reflected in these three images. And I share them for a couple reasons. One is it turns out this isn't actually a history lesson at all. It's actually a portrait of the current landscape. You can find examples of each of these portraits of community side by side in any city, in any state, in any country, maybe even in your community. And second, these portraits ought to prompt our reflection. As you think about your schools, which of these portraits most closely resembles what you see? And why are you stuck there? And what would it take to move forward? And third, I share this because I'm convinced that this progression does not yet depict our final destination. Because when you spend time talking with students with disabilities and their families, you find that they want to be much more than merely integrated and much more than simply included. They want to belong. And we all want to belong. Beyond integration and even further past inclusion is belonging. And I'm not sure quite how that gets depicted. I think In some ways, it means that we come to see one another in our schools in very different ways, not as the ins and outs and the labeled and the labelers and the members and the strangers, but as a single school or parish community. We're diverse, certainly, but each person of inestimable worth. Or at another level, I think it means that we do more than just share space. We also share our lives. We enter into relationship with one another, right? We remain involved in each other's lives the other 6 days of the week after the benediction, after the school bell rings, after we've clocked out from work. We don't leave and live parallel lives. So you see there's an important distinction between inclusion and belonging, the difference between being present and having presence, the difference between welcoming someone when they arrive and actually aching because of their absence. So how might our schools and our churches become communities of belonging for students with disabilities and their families? And what does it even mean to belong? If you were to reflect on the communities where you feel like you experience belonging, what would you point to that tells you that's the case, right? What would you point to that tells you that you belong or that people belong in your school? Well, it's a question that's cut across so much of the work that I'm involved in as a researcher and a teacher trainer who works closely with schools. What will tell us that we've arrived when we pursue belonging in our schools and congregations? Well, several years ago, we wrapped up a multi-year project that involved asking more than 500 teenagers with autism or intellectual disability, as well as their parents, about their experiences of inclusion and their understandings of belonging within their faith communities. And we've extended this work to schools and now other contexts as well. And after examining the themes that have cut across their experiences in these conversations, we've identified 10 key dimensions of belonging. And this is what we heard. I know I belong when I'm present, when I'm invited, when I'm welcomed and known, when I'm accepted, when I'm supported, when I'm heard, befriended, when I'm needed, and when I'm loved. It isn't just about where students spend their day. It's about the experiences and relationships they have in those various places. And belonging isn't experienced just because we start a new program, but because of the people that one encounters. And while we've made great strides to foster integration and inclusion in our Catholic schools, this next destination of belonging still seems elusive in far too many communities. So I'm going to focus my time today with you on what was meant by each of these 10 dimensions and how they connect to Catholic schooling. But the primary goal, of course, is to encourage your reflection, for you to consider how the ideas I share apply to your own school, whose welcome you are trying to widen. So ask yourself, in each of these 10 areas, what are you doing really well right now? What could you be doing better or differently? And how can you support your school community even better in each of these areas? So I hope you're ready, and we'll begin with presence, because belonging always begins with presence. And yet in so many communities, the principal barrier to belonging for students with disabilities may simply be their absence from the classrooms and clubs and cafeterias that make up our local schools, or from our colleges and community centers, from our workplaces or our worship spaces. It's hard to feel like you're part of a community only from the outside. And far too many families who desire a strong Christian education, they still struggle to find a school that will embrace their children with disabilities. And there are far too many Christian schools that struggle to include students with disabilities in the entire array of educational and social opportunities they offer. But belonging is built on a foundation of shared experiences and encounters over time. Because as children spend time with their peers within and beyond the classroom, the opportunities they have to become known and accepted and supported and befriended and needed and loved become all the more available. Belonging begins with presence. And there are enduring gaps between the experiences that students with disabilities envision for themselves and the opportunities they have to experience that involvement. Students with disabilities consistently tell us that they want to be part of rigorous and challenging classes. They want to prepare and pursue a college degree. They want to share their gifts in the workplace down the road, and they want to be part of a caring faith community. But it's hard to feel like you belong when you're not there. So think about your own school. To what extent are students with disabilities part of the breadth of experiences your school has to offer? Do they truly have a presence? And not just in the classrooms, but in all the different aspects of the school day, the clubs, the cafeterias, the courtyards, the hallways, the field trips, and elsewhere. And if the answer is no, reflect on what stands in the way of presence in your school. Can you name the barriers that you need to break down? Barriers of architecture or attitude or awareness. Maybe it's barriers of communication or expectation or invitation. Maybe it's barriers of theology or values, of finances or facilities, or perhaps just the boundaries of our imagination. It's hard to feel like you belong if you're not there. Well, presence is the baseline for belonging. It's the starting point, but it's not the destination, and we've got to press deeper. So the antidote to absence is an active invitation. And in so many classrooms and churches and other community settings, increasing presence may require extending new invitations. This is the second dimension of belonging shared by students with disabilities and their families. It was to be invited, to be sought out, to be pursued. And for many, we heard that belonging begins with a personal invitation, not a passive announcement. When we're not intentional about reaching into our communities, we inadvertently leave people out. In reflecting on the absence of people with disabilities from his faith community, one minister said, it's not that we deliberately excluded people with disabilities. In fact, we weren't deliberate at all, and that was the problem. I think this quote characterizes so well what we tend to see. We might be willing to welcome someone when they arrive or apply, but will we pursue them if they're not there? And aside from public schools, most community organizations are not legally mandated to pursue the presence of students with disabilities. Right? Not our workplaces, our colleges, our churches, or community programs. And it communicates something quite powerful when we do. We need you here. So what message would it send to a watching world if your school were the most inclusive place in your city? It certainly speaks volumes when Christian schools are at the forefront of educational inclusion in their community, no doubt. But I'll tell you, it also speaks volumes when they're not. And I find that communities often have the language down, but the talk doesn't always match the walk, does it? Everyone welcome. It's easy to say, it's harder to actually mean. And we all love to proclaim that we're welcoming, we're inclusive on our websites, on our signs, on our outreach materials. And while that's worthwhile, and we presume this is sufficient, right? Everyone is welcome. There is quite a big difference between an announcement and an invitation. An invitation is personal, an announcement's not. An invitation says we are thinking about you. An announcement always leaves open the possibility of an asterisk or an exception or a footnote or some other unspoken qualifier, like the question mark in this graphic. And there have been far too many asterisks that have been attached to our proclamations of welcome. For many people with disabilities and their families, those broad promises of a warm reception this time have not always been honored. So know that the announcements you make about your welcome and hospitality may not resonate with families that have been excluded in the past. And there have been more than a few. In one of our studies, we found that 1 in 3 families had previously left their congregation because their son or daughter with a disability was not welcomed or included. Right? 1 in 3. We don't have good data on the number of children turned away from Christian schools, but we all know that stories abound. And I think that many schools just aren't aware of how many children with disabilities live right in their midst. I think the same could be said of our churches and employers and community groups. And so the idea of inviting a section of their community that they've never noticed, it's just not on their radar. It's not that they've rejected the idea of inviting people with disabilities. Maybe it's never that they never thought about it. Well, there are 60 million Americans with disabilities, 19% of any community, 1 in 5 residents, and just over half of all individuals over 65 experienced some type of disability, for those of you who are thinking about your parishes now. And 1 in 7 children attending local public schools are receiving special education services, whether that's physical disabilities or cognitive impairments or visual or hearing impairments, whether it's autism or speech language difficulties or emotional behavioral challenges or any number of visible or invisible disabilities. It's clear that there are numerous children who reside right in the midst of every school and every church. And if statistics like this aren't convincing for communities, maybe a visual is. Because if you were to walk out into the neighborhoods that exist all around your school or your parish, The most recent census data tells us that 1 in every 3 or 4 households whose doors we knock on would include at least one family member with a disability, many of whom would be children with disabilities who could be served by your schools. 1 in 3 or 4. We are called to love our neighbor, called to serve our neighbor, to teach our neighbor, but who comes to mind when we think of who is our neighbor? And how might your school do more inviting of individuals you know would just love to receive such an invitation? And how might you guide them in this area? Well, schools and parishes can adopt a variety of approaches to extending these invitations. Some incorporate imagery and language into their outreach materials that communicate their commitment to being a place of belonging for students with disabilities. This might include crafting an inclusive mission or a vision statement, a detailing available supports and accommodations, incorporating photos or videos depicting diversity of your school membership, or just describing the disability-related support programs that you offer at your school or at your church. And then you can ask local disability agencies like the ARC or Autism Society or Down Syndrome Associations or any of the number of family support groups and other programs to pass along your invitations to the individuals and families they serve. Well, belonging also involves being welcomed. That was the third dimension of belonging that we heard. The posture with which children with disabilities are welcomed each day at school also impacts their sense of belonging. It's the hospitality they encounter from their teachers in their classes. It's the eagerness with which they're greeted by peers, all of which assures them that they have a real place within the school community. You know, when others delight in your presence, you feel at home. And when you're overlooked or ignored, you feel out of place. And for children with disabilities, there is no automatic assurance that they'll experience a warm reception when they arrive. And that can never be the case in Christian schools. So what does hospitality look like when disability is part of the equation? Reverse the question. What does hospitality look like for anyone? It means greeting students with disabilities by name, finding out more about them, drawing them into conversations with others, asking about their week, supporting their involvement in class activities, sitting together with them at lunch, remembering important events in their lives, inviting them to other school or after-school events, and checking in to find out why they're absent when they're absent. These are ordinary actions that send a powerful message that communicates to people that they are wanted. It demonstrates an authentic delight. Now, for schools that do not have a history of including students with disabilities, I know there's some uncertainty that can exist about how to best move forward in this area. Teachers and peers may benefit from receiving guidance on how to engage with individuals who maybe communicate differently or who require ongoing assistance or who behave in unfamiliar ways. They may need guidance on how to talk about disability in respectful and relevant ways or how to design programs and spaces with the entire community in mind. So draw upon disability organizations and other groups in your community who can help guide you in how to widen your welcome in these areas. Well, it's one thing to be welcomed, it's quite another to be known, and belonging is personal. A fourth aspect of belonging involves being known. We know this from our own theological tradition, this call to welcome the stranger. But the person is supposed to move from stranger to friend. And yet students with disabilities so often find themselves in the perpetual role of stranger. They're known about, but not known personally, known as the member of some larger group, but not known individually by their name. It's like that old sitcom Cheers, right? We all want to go where everybody knows our name. And school's no different. And yet children with disabilities can sometimes feel like strangers in their own schools. When students with disabilities spend most of their school day in separate classrooms, or when they're always on the peripheries of other of school activities, or when the opportunities they have to develop relationships with other students and staff are limited, then they're much less likely to become known personally. And moreover, I think the labels that we use to categorize students, learning disabilities, intellectual disability, autism, those things can also inadvertently shape how children are known. More often by their struggles than by their strengths, more often by their challenges rather than by their contributions. And Christian schools should be learning communities in which children with disabilities are seen as unique individuals who are created by God and endowed with inestimable worth. Teachers should strive to discover the talents and gifts and strengths and stories and passions and positive qualities of each student they serve. And this is a point worth parking on because so many of us in the disability system tend to talk about and write about students with regard to diagnostic terms and labels that almost always emphasize what someone can't do or struggle to do. And so when a church considers the question, well, how do we welcome people with autism into our community, or a Catholic school wonders, how do we include a teenager with an intellectual disability in our high school? If all they have to work from is an image of what a person cannot do, that makes for a challenging introduction. And so we have to rethink the ways we come to know people and the ways we introduce them to make sure we're leading with their strengths and gifts and passions and the positive qualities that remind us that someone is utterly indispensable, not the things that imply they're incapable. So can we think about students with disabilities first and foremost as having strengths and contributions and gifts to be received? And the answer should be absolutely and amen, right? That strengths-based stance, it's consistent with how so many family members describe their sons and daughters and siblings with disabilities. They talk about enviable qualities. They talk about God-given talents and skills. So communities that are committed to belonging seek to learn each student's story, and then they strive to understand the interests and passions and skills and gifts that person brings to community, right? As an educator, do you know those strengths and passions and interests and positive qualities? And what are the storylines with which you lead? Well, fifth, belonging is to be accepted. It's one thing to be included, it's quite another to be accepted. And real acceptance usually comes from being known personally, not from being known about. When we interviewed parents, for example, they spoke of their daughters and sons being welcomed without condition, treated like family, embraced for all of who they are. No asterisks, no footnotes. And while attitudes towards disability have changed dramatically over the last 50 years, a stigma and labeling and stereotypes still abound in our society, and they still often abound in our schools. Let me share just a collection of quotes from the church and school stories of families impacted by disability. These attitudes are reflected in all kinds of statements that they hear repeated back from a teacher or a pastor or a ministry leader of some kind. Well, the moral imperative for Christian schools is to foster a culture of acceptance, and that's even greater when placed within the gospel message. Shifting the attitudes of others, though, it can be challenging work. But as a field, we actually know quite a bit about the pathways for changing attitudes. There is a place for sharing information and providing education related to disability. And there's power in what each of us model to others and in the stories we tell. So living this out may involve sharing accurate information about the capabilities and the contributions of students with disabilities. It should involve modeling positive interactions and using affirming language and holding high expectations. And as a school, we may want to do things to prime people towards greater acceptance of students with disabilities. Those formal awareness events or campaigns, the embedding of curricular units into our courses around disability awareness and understanding, the offering of presentations or workshops. What might you do in your community to promote greater understanding of the individuality and the strengths and the gifts of people with disabilities? But let me emphasize that it will be the investments that we make in fostering friendships and promoting inclusive activities that will have the most substantial impact on the views communities hold. It turns out that personal contact is the key to promoting acceptance. Research examining attitude change finds that supporting positive interactions over time is the most promising pathway for changing views towards people with disabilities. In other words, real acceptance comes not from merely learning about someone, but from coming to know them personally. That's when your preconceived ideas about someone get overturned. And that's why it's so important to identify ways of creating shared activities in your school. Well, 6, support is critical to belonging. And children with disabilities often need additional support to participate fully in the life of their school. This might include receiving academic assistance during certain classes, maybe social supports during non-instructional times, or behavioral supports across the school day. And for some students, this support will be very modest and more episodic. But for others, it will be more substantial and it'll be more ongoing. But the provision of individualized support is a tangible demonstration of a school's commitment to their educational flourishing. It clearly communicates a desire for their presence, and the absence of support is often what leads to exclusion or limits meaningful participation. So schools that are communities of belonging see this investment in support as essential, not as optional. And they use person-centered planning approaches to decide which supports might be most beneficial for each child. They also build the capacity of all staff to support the diversity of students well in their classes and programs, and they encourage peers to serve as natural supports to their schoolmates who may need extra help, right? They can do all of these things because they know that that support is what enables participation. So this is the place for asking good questions. It's not the place for making advanced assumptions. The best supports are always individualized and contextualized, and they're always determined one person at a time. So this is the place for thoughtful, person-centered planning, for identifying those formal and natural supports that a person's going to need to be part of their community. But there's some caution that's warranted here. So often we think the best supports are those that are provided by adults or by professionals. And we're prone to surround students with disabilities with paraprofessionals and support staff and special educators. But when we do that to the exclusion of peers and other natural sources of support, we end up inadvertently crowding out other effective ways of supporting participation. My own research team has really focused on a number of practical ways of involving peers in supporting students with disabilities in inclusive classrooms and cafeterias and extracurriculars and community activities. We call these approaches peer support programs, peer support arrangements, peer networks, or peer partner programs, and that all depends on the configuration. But every single study we've conducted show noticeable advantages for students with disabilities when we rely on peers in these ways, and an incredible impact on the students without disabilities who have that opportunity to come alongside and get to know and befriend their schoolmates. Peers are one of the most ubiquitous sources of support, and they're more willing than you might think, but they need to be asked. And they're going to need some guidance so they're comfortable and confident in those support roles. Well, you can learn more about these approaches in some of the articles that I've linked off here in the handouts, and I hope that will intrigue you. And I know there's some other sessions on peer-mediated supports here at the conference as well. Well, seventh is to be heard. The perspectives of individuals with disabilities are still not often sought. And throughout so much of our field's history, the voices of professionals and parents have dominated this dialogue. But in recent decades, a shift towards self-advocacy has taken hold, and best practices now really emphasize the necessity of ensuring that people with disabilities have a say in all aspects of their lives. Being part of a community that also yearns to hear your voice, well, that can contribute to a sense of belonging. It's to be heard, to have a seat at the table, to be listened to be acknowledged, to be asked what you think, and maybe even to have an influence in some way. That tells you that your involvement and your insights matter. And students with disabilities will benefit from opportunities to learn and to practice the skills they need to share their preferences and to share their perspectives with others. The better they understand themselves, their strengths, their needs, their interests, their goals, and the more they know their community, the better they're going to be able to advocate for their needs and for the needs of others. And so this is why providing instructions related to self-determination and advocacy and leadership are so important. In fact, we have a wonderful guide. It's completely free called Fostering Self-Determination Among Children and Youth with Disabilities, Ideas for Parents and by Parents. It's a guide that you can share with families to help them fostering this capacity to share one's voice in and beyond the school. Well, eighth is to be befriended. And it is not good to be alone. Relationships are at the heart of belonging. It's having people in your life who know you and accept you, who need you and love you and miss you when you are not there. And this very simple conclusion comes from work across so many different disciplines, right? Talk with theologians, they will proclaim that we were designed for relationships and created for community. Talk to social scientists, and they will tell you that the absence of social connections negatively impacts well-being. Talk to health researchers, and they will point to the strong associations between isolation, loneliness, and actual mortality risk. All the other dimensions I've mentioned so far in this talk, they can be addressed in the absence of close and ongoing relationships. In other words, they can be done at arm's length. But friendships take belonging deeper, and it's just not good to be alone. And yet that's so often what we see for students with disabilities. Think about the relationships that comprise your own social networks, right? Your family members, your friends and close companions, your acquaintances, the people you work with, your neighbors, your teammates and clubmates and others. And then those people who are paid to be part of your life, right? Your doctor, your auto mechanic, your boss. You would have names that abound for you. And hopefully they would show up if we put the names of people you knew in all these different circles. What's fascinating is that when you look at the social circles of students with disabilities, it's not that we see a different number of names that show up. It's often that we see those names show up in very different circles. Lots of family members, lots of professionals and paid supports, but a paucity of friends and acquaintances and others. What can we do to expand the number of students who come to know and befriend and learn alongside their classmates with disabilities? This is important because the friendships that are so fundamental to human flourishing are elusive for so many students with autism. We know from a national study of middle school and high school students with autism that 43% of youth with autism never see friends outside of school, 84% have never or rarely received phone call from friends, and half have not been invited to any other youth social activities during the past year. The portrait's not very different in elementary school. 32% of children with autism are reported by their parents to never visit with friends outside of school. 81% don't get those phone calls, and 1 in 3 have not been invited to other kids' social activities, not once. And we see a similar portrait for kids with other types of disabilities, and I've put those on your screen as well. My point is that we have to be intentional about relationships or they don't happen. Think about the students that you're supporting in your school and ask yourself, can we name people in the community who she can eat with and walk with, celebrate with and cry with, play with and pray with, shop with, watch the big game with, do absolutely nothing with? Can we name people whose job it isn't to do these things? And can we name people who do this because they just love Sarah or Benjamin or Liam, right? What are we doing that inadvertently limits these relationships? And how do we prioritize relationships right alongside rigor and relevance and faith development? Well, there is a formula to friendship formation. You can't make people be friends, but we do know that friendships form most often around shared activities built around common interests that happen over time when students are provided just enough support and valued roles, right? And so I hope you see here the importance of what takes place beyond the walls of our classrooms, beyond the walls of our sanctuaries, and outside of people's homes. It's life lived together that pushes people beyond mere acquaintances and pushes them towards close friendships. Ordinary things like sharing a good meal, participating in a favorite hobby, visiting the local mall together, taking a stroll through the park, watching the big game, joining the same small group, right? These are really important, ordinary shared experiences. And it has implications for how we think about programming related to people with disabilities. Because if our main school models are largely separate or segregated, then the opportunity that students have to be chosen as a friend becomes limited. And the opportunities for others in our school to encounter the friendship and enviable qualities of students with disabilities also becomes limited. And that leads to the 9th dimension. We know we belong when we're needed, and everyone wants to feel needed. We hope to be recognized as having gifts and making contributions that enrich the lives of others. We want some assurance that our presence matters and makes some meaningful difference in the lives of others. Right? The portrait of the church that Paul presents in Corinthians is a reminder that every person is utterly indispensable within the body, and we all have need for one another. So we feel needed when others see us as bringing gifts and talents that benefit the entire community, right? This is service and leadership by people with disabilities. This is ministry by people with disabilities. It's a change in our prepositions from service to service by, from leadership to or leader of to leadership by, from ministry to ministry by people with disabilities. And yet people with disabilities are too often viewed as the designated recipients of service and outreach. So what can we do to put students with disabilities in valued roles like anyone else? This might come from volunteering or taking on leadership responsibilities, helping others in need, participating in high-status activities, serving in one's church, having a meaningful job, assisting on important projects, having a role on a team, or contributing in any other number of ways. To feel important, to feel needed. And that's why I love this church sign so much. I stopped to take this picture while driving my son to school several years ago, and I know it's probably blasphemous to show a Presbyterian sign at a Catholic conference. I'm not quite sure, but it's the message that I love. And it suggests a posture that every school ought to adopt as they think about their community, a community that includes students with disabilities. We need you here ASAP. Here's the passage that sign referenced, the paraphrase of it. Because when we're convinced it's true, our movements as a school look very, very different. We stop thinking about inclusion as something nice to do because it's good for someone else, and we start to see that it's part of what actually strengthens our school community. We're no longer satisfied to wait till students arrive to welcome them. We start pursuing children whose gifts are missing, and we start really extending new invitations widely throughout our community. And we stop tinkering with and retrofitting our existing school programs, and we start to design them from the outset with everyone in our community in mind, including students with disabilities. Well, finally, there is love. And people tend to go to great lengths for those whom they love, don't they? They make allowances, they go the extra mile, they extend grace, they sacrifice their own interests, they avoid what is expedient, they work for their good. And love is what leads people to care about someone's flourishing all 7 days of the week, after school dismisses, and beyond the benediction. Because when people talk about the communities that matter most to them, they often talk about the love they encounter there. And where love abounds, belonging is much more likely to be experienced. And as Christians, we are called to be a people who love lavishly. And we're called to be a people who love unconditionally. Above all of the things, Christian schools should abound in love. Because that love is what then compels us to invite and welcome and know and accept and support and care for and befriend and need children with and without disabilities. And in doing so, our love for one another only grows deeper. So the scriptures remind us over and over that all we do and all we are must be marked by love. Public schools and disability service systems are not called or designed to love, but the church is. So lest I sound a bit like I'm preaching, the greatest of all these 10 dimensions of belonging may very well be to be loved. So that's the portrait of belonging from the vantage point of students with disabilities and their families. And I hope it's one that pushes you towards reflection. As you think about your schools, are students with and without disabilities personally invited? Are they present in all aspects of the life of that school? Are they experiencing a warm welcome whenever they arrive? Are they well known throughout your school by their names and strengths? Are they accepted without condition or caveat? Are they provided the support they need to participate fully and meaningfully? And are they having their voices heard and their perspectives sought? Are they developing and deepening friendships with others? Are they seen as needed and indispensable to the thriving of the community? And are they loved deeply and unconditionally? This is the portrait of belonging that we've heard from individuals with disabilities and their families. And I hope you see this journey to belonging as one worth pursuing. There is much reflection to do and much action to take. So which of these portraits describe the communities that you teach in, or work in, or worship in, or live in? And what steps might you take to move further along this journey? What's the portrait that best depicts your school? And what's the nature of your testimony in this area? I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, this special issue on inclusive Catholic schools. And I look forward to learning more about what you do as you put these ideas into practice. Thank you.